Hello! So, for today, I asked you to read Maria Tatar's introduction to the Cinderella stories and two versions of Cinderella, Charles Perrault's Donkeyskin and Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm's Cinderella. One of the goals of this class is to introduce you to different genres of literature for adolescents. And so, what are fairy tales doing here? I mean, aren't they for kids? Fairy tales are often retold for older audiences. You might think of the Once Upon a Time television series, Stephen Sondheim's musical, Into the Woods, and young adult novels like Melinda Lowe's Ash. The original fairy tales were not for children, and then they were. Kind of. Fairy tales date back thousands of years. Many are passed down through the oral tradition, which is something you might notice as you read these versions of them, because there are these repetitions, right? Things often come in threes. Well, if something is passed down orally, repetition helps you remember. Literary fairy tales date back to about the 14th century, and back then, fairy tales were not intended for children, and for that matter, not for most adults, since most adults could not actually read. Educated people wrote and read them. They were an interesting way to tell a story and even make a point. By the late 17th century, people began to adapt them for children, ostensibly to teach children, and so the moral becomes more important. The rise of children's literature in the 18th century brought with it the rise of fairy tales adapted for children. Even though fairy tales were adapted for children, they still contain themes that are more adult and young adult than perhaps children, as is evidenced by the fairy tales that you read for today. Common themes of fairy tales recall those that we also find in young adult fiction. The struggle to achieve autonomy, to break away from your parents. You might think here of Beauty and the Beast, or for that matter, Cinderella. The discovery that we're all alone on our journey to maturity. That anxiety over the failure to meet the expectations of your parents. Anxiety over being displaced. And in short, these are not the sanitized, animated, singing tea kettle and candlestick versions that you might remember from your childhood. They are often darker, but you can see the appeal of the fairy tale genre for adaptations. And this is one feature of the fairy tale that I really like. There's a way in which the fairy tale pares down the elements of the narrative, distills them to their purest components. The setting is kind of generic. Woods, castle, garden. We lack specific details of time and of place. Character tends to be flat, simple, straightforward. These are not complex characters. This is not psychological realism. We don't get a complex set of motivations. Instead, we have a singular motivation. Character is most likely good or evil. Fairy tales traffic in stereotypes. There are powerful, wicked stepmothers. There are jealous siblings. And they're often defined by a physical description that aids that stereotype, although they also use disguises that can trick other characters or you from recognizing who they really are. The plot is usually formulaic. The journey is probably symbolic in some way. As I mentioned earlier, there are these repeated patterns which are probably derived from the ritual of oral storytelling because they help the storyteller remember. They are really all plot, suspense, action. That's in some ways more important than character development. Common themes include journeys, include transformations, include trickster characters like the wolf in Little Red Riding Hood, and perhaps most famously, magic that is treated matter-of-factly. We are not surprised when a wolf talks, or fairies turn out to be real and not purely imaginary. And that's something I like about fairy tales and why I think they are so well suited to adaptation. There's something elemental about them. They've distilled story down to its elements. And having done so, made those elements more visible, more mobile, more adaptable. 3 questions. And as always, in your answers, you should bring in examples from the stories. First question. Based on what you already know about the Cinderella story, what surprised you the most about the versions that you read for today? Perrault's Donkeyskin and the Grimm's Cinderella. Question number 2. What does each of these stories teach us about the rules of romantic relationships for men and boys versus the rules of romantic relationships for women and girls? Question number 3. Fairy tales are famous for having morals. Virtue rewarded, vice punished. So in each of these 2 tales, what virtues are rewarded and what vices are punished? And really look at the story. Don't just quote the moral. Perrault's story, for example, ends with a whole bunch of morals. Does his story actually support any of these? If so, which ones? The Grimm story doesn't spell out the moral in the same way that Perrault's does, but it does end with marriage and punishment. So think about what moral or message these stories are conveying and point to some examples to back that up. A final thought here from the great Australian artist Sean Tan, winner of the Astrid Lindgren Prize, which is the top prize in children's literature, and whose work you probably know via his book, The Arrival. Sean Tan has observed that, quote, Grimm's fairy tales are closer to dreams than stories. So I will leave you with an image from Sean Tan's Cinderella, which you can dream about. Until next time, when we'll be discussing the first part of Melinda Lowe's Ash, a novel that also includes dreams and stories and plenty of questions about who has power in relationships. And of course, the coming of age of Ash, who, as you will discover, is a version of Cinderella. I hope you enjoy it. I look forward to talking with you about Ash in our next class. Until then,